It was 1 a.m. on an Appalachian backroad when I first noticed them. Two perfect white circles that didn't bounce, following every move with eerie precision.
The unnatural headlights behind me. Two perfect white circles that don't bounce, don't shift, and follow every movement with eerie precision.
I was somewhere past the state line, on a road so forgotten it didn't even pretend to be part of the modern world anymore, when the night first began to feel wrong. I'd taken that back route only because I didn't want to deal with the interstate. I told myself it was just one of those nights when the air felt heavy and the dark pressed close, but there was something else clinging to the edges of the drive. A strange, quiet tension that kept settling in the cabin of my car no matter how many times I tried to shake it off. It was close to 1 in the morning when I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in nearly an hour. The road wound endlessly through those tall Appalachian ridges, and the trees rose on both sides like thick black walls. Every now and then my headlights would catch a bit of mist drifting low to the ground, or the quick darting movement of an animal deeper in the brush, but mostly it was just darkness. The kind that feels old. The kind that feels watched. I had my window cracked because the heater in my car tends to blow too hot, and every time I rounded a curve, a slice of cold mountain air would slip inside and make me shiver. The clock on the dashboard blinked 12:58 a.m. when I first saw the glow appear in my rearview mirror. At first it was faint, just a soft white halo far behind me, barely noticeable against the pitch-black road. But then it grew brighter, sharper, and something in my stomach tightened before my brain had even processed why. I told myself it was just another late-night traveler making time through the mountains. But part of me already knew something was off. The headlights didn't bounce with the uneven pavement. They didn't shift or dip or react to curves. They were two perfect white circles that stayed exactly the same distance apart, shining straight ahead with a rigid intensity that made the hairs along my arms rise. I watched them for a while, trying to convince myself they belonged to some old truck with stiff suspension, but even then it didn't make sense. Nothing on these mountain roads drives that smoothly. Nothing stays that steady. When I slowed down to get a better look through the mirror, the lights slowed too, mirroring my speed so precisely that I felt a cold prickle of fear in my chest. I hadn't yet admitted it to myself, but something deep inside me already understood. Whoever, or whatever, was behind me wasn't behaving like a normal car. I pressed the gas, not enough to accelerate hard, but enough that the distance between us should have widened. The lights tightened their approach, matching my speed exactly, closing in until they were near enough that the inside of my car glowed harsh white. Still no engine noise. Still no silhouette behind the wheel. I tried adjusting the mirror, angling it upward to spare my eyes, but all that did was allow the lights to reflect off the roof of my car, filling the interior with an eerie pallor. My pulse quickened, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I told myself it had to be a prank. Someone messing around on a lonely road because they knew anyone out here would be easy to rattle. But that explanation didn't hold. Not when the light stayed so impossibly precise, so unnaturally fixed. I took a sharp left around a bend, one of those curves that usually forces cars to slow and lean with the turn. The lights didn't budge. They remained perfectly centered in my mirror, as if the vehicle behind me was gliding, not driving. The road grew narrower as I continued deeper into the ridge, and the trees clawed overhead, cutting out the sky completely. I tried turning on the radio just for noise, but all I got was static. Not even the faint trace of a station. That silence, broken only by the hum of my own engine, did something to me. It made the situation feel too contained, too isolated, like there was no world left beyond this stretch of road. The lights in my mirror grew so bright they washed out everything else, and I felt myself starting to panic. I kept glancing between the windshield and the mirror, watching the white circles press closer until it felt like they were right on top of me. My heartbeat thudded loud enough to drown out the static. I must have whispered something, maybe a curse, maybe a prayer, because my throat felt tight and dry. I'd reached a point where the road narrowed into a single-lane bridge, one of those old wooden ones with planks so worn you can feel each one rattle under the tires. I eased onto the shoulder before the bridge, intending to let the car behind me pass. My blinker clicked softly in the stillness. The lights drew nearer, and I braced myself for them to pull around. But they didn't. They simply stopped behind me, perfectly aligned, perfectly still, like two blank eyes trained on my back. For a moment the entire world felt suspended. No wind. No movement. The insects that had been buzzing just moments earlier seemed to fall silent. My breath fogged the windshield in slow, trembling patches. I waited for the door behind those lights to open, for a figure to step out, for some explanation to reveal itself, but nothing happened. The headlights just glared at the rear of my car, bright enough to cast long, sharp shadows of the tree trunks ahead of me. I turned off my own headlights, thinking it would help me see more clearly through the mirror. But all it did was plunge the interior of my car into darkness while the outside remained washed in those two white beams. My hand hovered over the door handle for a long second. I knew I shouldn't get out. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, lock the doors and just wait for it to pass or disappear. But not knowing who was behind me was somehow worse. So I stepped out onto the cold asphalt, the air biting my face the moment I left the warmth of the heater. I kept my door open behind me as I walked toward the back of the car. "Hello." My voice sounded too small, too thin. "You all right?" The glow from the headlights was so strong that I had to shield my eyes. I took a few steps toward them, cautious but determined, trying to make out the shape of the vehicle itself. But the lights made it impossible to see anything beyond their glare. The shadows of the trees stretched long and distorted across the road, swaying faintly as if something unseen was shifting among them. I called out again, louder this time, but all I heard in return was the low hum of my engine and the soft buzz of insects returning to life. And then the lights flickered. Just once at first, a quick dimming as though the power behind them had faltered. I froze. They flickered again, longer this time, casting the road into alternating flashes of brilliance and darkness. The air around me grew unnervingly cold, like a pocket of winter had settled over the bridge. The hairs on the back of my neck lifted. I took a step back, instinct urging me toward the safety of my car. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. Not turned off. Not dimmed out. They blinked out of existence completely, leaving behind nothing but an empty road swallowed in black. The absence of light was so abrupt that I stumbled backward, heart slamming against my ribs. My eyes struggled to adjust, and for a few disorienting seconds I saw afterimages. Two perfect white circles floating before me like ghostly imprints. When my vision finally cleared, there was nothing there. No car. No engine noise. No tire marks on the gravel shoulder. Just the hollow stillness of the mountains at night. I scrambled back into my vehicle, slamming the door shut and locking it without thinking. My breathing was loud and uneven in the small cabin. I flicked the headlights back on, illuminating the empty stretch of road behind me. Somehow that made me feel worse. I crossed the bridge and kept driving, refusing to check the mirror again even though I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against the back of my neck. The road seemed twice as long on the way out. Every turn felt unfamiliar. I couldn't shake the sense that something was moving just beyond the reach of my headlights, pacing me through the trees. When I finally reached the county line, a flood of distant highway lights greeted me like the first sign of civilization I'd seen in hours. Only then did I allow myself to breathe again, though the relief felt thin and unsteady. I didn't go home right away. I had to stop at a gas station just to gather myself, leaning against the cold metal of the pump while trying to calm the shaking in my hands. The clerk inside gave me a strange look when I walked in to buy a coffee, like he could tell something had followed me there, something invisible but heavy enough to cling to my expression. It wasn't until I pulled into my driveway around 3 in the morning that I noticed the final detail, the one that still turns my stomach every time I think about it. When I walked around to unload my bag from the trunk, I saw that both of my taillights were scorched black. Not cracked. Not smashed. Burned. The plastic was melted and bubbled, warped as though something had pressed right up against them with enough heat to deform the material. I ran my hand over the damage and felt the faint ridges of warped plastic. The center of each taillight had been affected the most, right where the bulb sat. It was unmistakable. Those lights, whatever they were, had been close enough to burn my car. I stood there in the quiet of the night, listening to the chorus of insects around my house, the distant hoot of an owl. Everything felt normal here. Safe even. And yet there was a part of me that couldn't shake the image of those blinding white circles floating behind me along that forgotten road, steady and unnatural, tracking every move I made. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those lights hovering in the dark behind me, illuminating the trees like a silent stage. I tried telling myself it was some kind of mechanical malfunction or a trick of perspective, but those excuses dissolved every time I thought of the scorched plastic or the sudden way the lights had vanished. Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake stopping the car that night. If stepping out, calling into the darkness, somehow invited something I didn't understand. I've avoided that back road ever since. I stick to routes with traffic, with lights, with people. And yet there are nights, usually when I'm driving alone and the sky turns that deep mountain black, when I catch the faintest glow in my rearview mirror. Not enough to scare me at first, just enough to remind me. Enough to make me keep checking the mirror over and over, waiting to see if the glow will sharpen into two perfect white circles again. And sometimes, I swear I see them lingering at the edge of the darkness, steady and unblinking, keeping pace no matter where I go. I was trying to outrun a storm that night, though the truth is I didn't have any real reason to hurry. I just didn't want to be home yet. Didn't want to sit in that small living room with a leaky window that let in every cold draft and reminded me how empty the place had become since my dad passed. So I took the long way home, winding through the back roads that cut between ridges and dipped into hollows where the trees swallowed most of the sky. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until early morning, but the clouds were already rolling in thick, and the wind carried that sharp metallic smell that comes with heavy rain in the mountains. It was past midnight when I reached the stretch near mile marker 12, a section of road that had always felt a little strange to me. Too quiet, too empty, the kind of place where headlights seemed to disappear faster than they should. My beams cut through the dark as I rounded a slight bend, and that's when I saw her. A girl, no more than 16, maybe 17, standing alone on the shoulder. Her long hair hung forward, blown slightly by the wind. She wore a pale dress, something that looked thin and out of place in the cold. One arm was wrapped tight around her chest like she was freezing. The other hung at her side, limp, barely moving. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at the road at all. She kept her gaze fixed on the tree line, as though something inside the woods held her attention. Something she was scared to turn away from. My foot eased off the gas without me even realizing it, and the car coasted until I was rolling beside her. I cracked my window halfway. Cold air rushed in, carrying the damp smell of leaves and the distant threat of rain. "You okay?" I asked, though even as I said it, I felt this strange weight in my chest, like I was interrupting something I shouldn't. She didn't look at me, didn't react to the sound of my voice, not even with a flinch. For a long second, the only sound was the low rumble of my idling engine and the faint rustle of branches swaying above us. Then, without turning her head, without shifting her posture or breaking her stare from the trees, she said in a soft whisper, "Don't look for me after the curve." Her tone wasn't frightened. It wasn't pleading. It was calm, almost rehearsed, like she'd said it many times before. The words made no sense to me. I sat there, confused, waiting for her to explain, but she didn't. She just kept staring at the dark woods like something inside them was timing her every breath. I wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her posture, something stiff and resigned, made my mouth go dry. There was a curve ahead, maybe 200 or 300 feet up the road. A sharp horseshoe bend carved right into the rock, the kind you have to slow down for because the guardrail there is old and flimsy and doesn't inspire much confidence. I'd driven it dozens of times. Nothing unusual about it. At least, nothing I'd ever noticed. I put the car in park for a moment, torn between helping her and listening to the prickling unease creeping up my spine. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, though my voice felt too loud in the quiet night. Her breath hitched once, barely noticeable, and her fingers tightened against her arm as though the cold was suddenly biting deeper. But she still didn't turn toward me. She just whispered again, barely audible over the wind, "Don't look for me." That was the moment I knew, not in any rational way but in the deep, instinctive part of myself, that something was terribly wrong. I rolled the window up slowly, my eyes never leaving her small, still frame. I eased the car forward, watching her in the mirror. She didn't move. Not an inch. She remained staring into the woods as if she belonged to them more than she did to the road. I approached the curve, tension coiling tight in my gut. The trees pressed close on the left, and the guardrail hugged the right side. My headlights illuminated the bend in a long sweeping arc as I turned the wheel. That was when I saw it. At first, it looked like a shape hunched low against the embankment, so still that for a second I thought it was just a boulder or a fallen tree trunk. But then the light moved across it, and the outline sharpened. It wasn't a boulder. It wasn't any kind of animal I recognized either. Something crouched there, pressed close to the ground, its limbs drawn up tight in a way that made its silhouette wrong. Unnatural. Too long in some places. Too narrow in others. Its head jerked, not turning like a person's head should, but snapping sharply, as if reacting to the sweep of my headlights. It angled toward me, and even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I felt it looking at me. Listening. Every muscle in my body tightened. I didn't slow down. I didn't even breathe. I kept my hands firmly on the wheel and followed the curve without letting my eyes linger longer than a heartbeat. Something primal inside me screamed that stopping would be a mistake. That acknowledging whatever I'd seen would only invite something worse. As soon as the road straightened, I pressed harder on the gas. The darkness behind me felt heavier, like it was pushing at my back, urging me forward. I drove for miles without glancing at the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see if I did. I didn't stop until I reached a lit gas station on the outskirts of a small town. Only then did my breath return, shallow and shaky, and only then did I notice how badly my hands were trembling against the steering wheel. I stayed there until the sun began to tint the sky, watching the early morning workers go about their routines, grounding myself in the ordinary. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself that exhaustion and the storm clouds had played tricks on me. I told myself the girl was just someone who'd gotten caught out late, that the thing by the curve was just a deer in a strange posture or a stump that my fear warped into something sinister. But the memory lingered like a splinter I couldn't quite pull out. Her voice replayed in my mind over and over. Don't look for me after the curve. On the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know whether she had been real or whether my imagination had twisted the night into something it wasn't. Around dusk, when the sky still held a little light, I drove back to that same stretch of road. The mountains felt different in the daytime, less ominous, more familiar, but my stomach knotted tighter the closer I got to mile marker 12. When I finally pulled over onto the shoulder, the place looked completely ordinary. No girl. No sign anyone had been standing there. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional chirp of evening insects. But then I saw the footprints. They were small, much smaller than mine, pressed deep into the soft dirt near the shoulder. Bare footprints. They led from the road straight toward the tree line, the same direction she had been staring. I followed them with my eyes, expecting them to continue into the woods, but they didn't. They stopped abruptly just a few feet past the shadow of the branches, as though whoever made them had stepped into the trees and simply vanished. I felt the cold air settle around me, heavier than before, and for a long moment I stood there staring into the darkening woods, expecting to see movement between the trunks or hear a whisper of fabric or breath. But there was nothing. Just the quiet. Just the fading light. Just the knowledge that whatever I'd seen that night had been real enough to leave marks in the dirt, but not real enough to leave a trail. And as I drove home, I realized the part that unsettled me the most wasn't the creature by the curve or the sudden disappearance of the footprints. It was the girl's voice repeating in my head, steady and rehearsed, "Don't look for me after the curve." Like she knew what waited there. Like she knew I would see it. And like she knew, somehow, that she wouldn't be around for anyone who tried to come back. Even now, when I drive late at night and pass mile markers on empty mountain roads, I find myself gripping the wheel a little tighter, watching the shoulders for a glimpse of pale fabric or long hair. Sometimes I wonder if she's still out there, standing in the same place, staring into the woods. Sometimes I wonder if someone else has heard that same whispered warning. But what haunts me more than anything else is the thought that maybe she wasn't warning me about the creature at the curve. Maybe she was warning me about herself. I was already running on fumes by the time I reached that hollow, the kind of dip in the mountains where the road sinks lower than it should and the trees grow too close together, leaning in like they're eavesdropping on whoever's foolish enough to pass through. The sky had gone that bruised purple color that happens just before darkness takes the rest, and the only sign of anything human was a faint flicker of a buzzing light far ahead. The glow so weak I wasn't even sure it was real. I remember glancing at the fuel gauge and seeing the needle hugging the bottom, and for a moment I seriously considered pushing on and risking the last few miles instead of trusting whatever old relic was still running out there. But when the engine sputtered once, just a cough, not a stall, that was enough to make the decision for me. I coasted down the last slope into the hollow and saw a gas station hunched on the left side of the road, half swallowed by shadow, tucked so far under the ridge that the sky above it was barely a sliver. Everything about it looked abandoned. The peeling paint, the sagging roofline, the windows so dusty they were almost opaque, but the buzzing fluorescent tube under the overhang was alive, flickering like it had a nervous twitch. The pumps were ancient, the kind with metal dials instead of screens, and for a second I thought the whole place might just be a leftover set piece from some forgotten era that nobody had gotten around to demolishing yet. But as soon as I lifted the pump handle, there was a sharp click and a sputtering whine, and the numbers stuttered to life behind the cloudy plastic window. That alone should have told me enough. Anything old enough to look that dead shouldn't have woken up that easily. But I was cold, tired, and out of options, so I let the gas flow while I kept glancing around at the hollow like something was going to step out of it. The woods were too still. Not just quiet. Still, like the air was thick enough to drown sound before it could travel. Even my own breathing felt muted, like I was hearing it through cotton. Inside the station, things didn't make any more sense. The door creaked like a living thing when I pushed it open, and a bell chimed somewhere above me even though I didn't see any bell hanging. The whole place smelled like dust, rusted shelving, and something colder, almost metallic, as if the building itself had been left in a freezer for too long. The lights buzzed overhead, not bright enough to truly illuminate anything, just enough to make the shadows restless. And then I saw the man behind the counter. He stood perfectly still, hands resting flat on the glass, eyes fixed on me like he'd been waiting a long time for someone to walk through that door. He didn't greet me. He didn't nod. He didn't even blink for the first few seconds I was inside, and I remember feeling ridiculous muttering a simple, "evening," into that heavy silence. He blinked once, slow, almost delayed, and his gaze tracked me across the room as I approached the register to pay. I didn't hear him breathe. I didn't hear the rustle of clothes. Nothing. The only sound was the faint hum of whatever dying machinery kept the lights on. I handed him cash without bothering to ask if they had card readers. Places like this never do, and he reached out to take it with a kind of sluggishness that made my skin prickle. His fingers were cold. Not cool, cold, like he'd been holding his hands in ice water before I walked in. I tried to say something else then, some useless filler line about how late it was or how lucky I was to find the station still open. But the words died in my throat when I realized he wasn't listening. His eyes were locked not on me but slightly past me, over my shoulder, like he was watching something approach from behind. When I turned, there was nothing but shelves stocked with dusty cans and expired snacks. I should have left right then. Paid, taken my receipt, and gone. But I made the mistake of pausing near the door, where an old corkboard hung crooked on the wall. It was covered in yellowed, curling photographs. Grainy snapshots of people standing beside their cars. Some photos had dates scribbled in fading ink. Some didn't. None of the people seemed aware they were being photographed first. Most were looking off to the side, mid-movement, caught in a moment they probably hadn't realized was being captured. Then my eyes landed on a photo that made my stomach drop hard. My car. Not one like it, my actual car. Same color. Same small dent on the bumper from when I'd backed into a rock 2 winters ago. Same license plate number. But the driver in the photo wasn't me. He looked like me, close enough that you'd think we were related. But I knew with an immediate, visceral certainty that the person in that picture wasn't me. The date handwritten under it was from 2 years earlier. I just stood there staring at the photo so long that I didn't hear the man behind the counter until he spoke. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the space around him, like the room didn't want sound traveling through it. "Folks get lost out here," he said, each word drawn out like it had to be pulled from a deep well. Always have. Always will. When I looked back at him, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the door, and for a single disorienting moment, I thought he was afraid. Truly afraid. I stepped outside into a silence so absolute it felt wrong. Not a single insect chirping. No wind threading through the trees. Even the faint hum of the gas pump I'd been using had ceased, though I didn't remember hanging the handle back up. The hollow felt colder than it had minutes earlier, as if something in the air had changed in my absence. When I glanced back at the station window, the clerk wasn't there anymore. I hadn't heard him move. I hadn't heard anything. One moment he was behind the counter, the next the space was empty. I told myself to get in my car, turn the key, and leave, but the hollow had a way of making every movement feel like stepping into deep water. Slow, heavy, reluctant. Even unlocking the car door felt louder than it should have, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. As soon as the engine started, I felt a pulse of relief. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the road ahead, but the light didn't seem to carry as far as it should have. The darkness in the hollow wasn't just absence of light. It felt dense, like fog made of shadow. I pulled away from the station, half expecting someone to step out into the beam of my headlights, but the road ahead was empty. I kept checking the rearview mirror, watching the station shrink behind me, but after a certain point it simply wasn't there anymore. Not faded. Not distant. Gone, like I'd driven out of a pocket of reality and sealed the entrance behind me. The road wound out of the hollow in slow, crawling curves, the kind that force you to take your time even when your instincts scream to go faster. Halfway up the incline, the engine stuttered again, not dying, just catching like something was interfering with the combustion. I pressed the gas, urging it on, and the needle on the fuel gauge flickered erratically even though I'd filled the tank. Then the air inside the car grew colder. Not gradually. Instantly. As if someone had opened a freezer beside me. The hair on my arms rose and I felt something, a pressure, maybe, settle behind me, not touching me but present enough to make my heart hammer against my ribs. I didn't want to look in the mirror. I didn't even want to look at the windows. I kept my eyes locked on the center of the road as if the slightest glance away would let something get closer. When I finally reached the ridge and the road leveled out, the temperature inside the car normalized abruptly, like someone had lifted a weight off the vehicle. The forest around me returned to its normal Appalachian quiet. Still eerie, but ordinary enough that I could finally breathe again. I drove all the way home without stopping or slowing, and when I parked in my driveway, the engine let out another one of those choked coughs before shutting off. I sat there gripping the steering wheel long after the headlights faded, trying to make sense of what had happened in the hollow, convincing myself I'd imagined parts of it, that exhaustion had twisted things in my mind. It wasn't until the next morning, when I noticed fingerprints smeared faintly on the outside of my rear window, long, thin streaks across the glass, that I realized I hadn't imagined as much as I had hoped. I went back 2 days later. I told people it was because I wanted closure, but the truth is simpler. I went back because something in me needed to know whether that station was real or if I'd stumbled into some kind of waking nightmare. The drive through the mountains was uneventful, the roads empty, the woods bare and windless. When I reached the hollow, I slowed down without meaning to, scanning both sides of the road for the station. I knew exactly where it should be. There was a distinctive bend in the road, a rock outcropping shaped like a leaning pillar just past it. But the station wasn't there. Not even a foundation. Not rubble. Not stray pieces of signage. Just forest. Thick, undisturbed forest that looked like it had been growing for decades without interruption. The only thing that told me I wasn't losing my mind was the faint impression of tire tracks on the gravel shoulder where I remembered parking 2 nights earlier. And one more thing. Near the base of the trees, partially obscured by fallen leaves, was a single photograph lying face down. When I picked it up, the back was blank. When I turned it over, my blood froze. It was the same photo from the corkboard. My car. The other man, the one who looked like me, standing beside it with a hesitant half-smile, like he wasn't sure he wanted his picture taken. Only this time, the background wasn't the gas station. It was the edge of the forest, the very spot I was standing in. And behind him, barely visible between 2 trees, was a figure. Not the clerk. Not me. Not anything I could identify. Just a shadow shaped like a person, its face indistinct, its posture rigid, turned toward him like it was watching. I dropped the photograph and stumbled back onto the road, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I didn't pick it up. I didn't look for it again. I got into my car and drove away from that hollow as fast as I could, and I haven't gone back since. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind outside dies down all at once like someone's holding their breath, I think about the clerk's words. Folks get lost out here. Always have. Always will. I keep wondering whether he meant lost in the woods, lost in the roads, or lost in something else entirely. Something that takes people who look like us, drives cars like ours, walks into places just minutes before we arrive, leaving behind only photographs and silence and that cold metallic smell lingering in the air. And every once in a while, I swear I hear that old gas pump click to life somewhere in the dark, followed by the slow, deliberate inhale of someone standing just behind me, waiting. I'd been driving since late evening, the kind of slow, endless push through dark mountain corridors that wears you out in strange ways, where the road feels longer than it should and the radio eventually becomes nothing but low noise you don't really hear anymore. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself stuck behind an old coal truck working its way up a ridge, crawling so slowly I could have walked faster. The thing looked ancient, the kind of truck that had probably been hauling loads up and down those mountains since before I was born. Its tailgate was rusted through in spots, the brake lights cracked and leaking water, and one of the rear mud flaps slapped wildly against the gravel whenever the truck hit a bump. I muttered out loud without meaning to, complaints to nobody but myself, until I noticed something about the driver. His left arm was out the window waving. Not a casual wave. Not telling me to pass. His arm moved in frantic arcs, pushing backward, toward me. He was telling me to stay back, to create distance. I didn't understand, but something in the way he moved, jerky, panicked, almost desperate, made me ease off the gas without thinking. The truck lumbered onward, and his arm kept motioning, more violently now, almost as if he was afraid I wouldn't get the message. The ridge was steep, and the trees leaned in tight on both sides of the road, forming a corridor of darkness around us. The air felt unnaturally still. My headlights reached the back of that truck, shining on the grime-caked tailgate and the straps that held down the tarp over what I assumed was a light load. The road finally straightened enough that I could make out the driver's side mirror on the truck. That's when I saw his face reflected in it. A brief flash, a sliver of pale skin and wide eyes. It wasn't irritation or road fatigue I saw. It was raw panic. Like he was watching something approach, something he didn't have time to explain. That's when I heard the tapping. At first it was faint, like a piece of gravel bouncing off my undercarriage. But it didn't stop. It grew more deliberate, sharper, more spaced out. Tap, tap, tap. Like something crawling along the frame of my car, moving with an intent that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. My first instinct was to check the road. Maybe something kicked up from the truck, maybe loose debris. But there was nothing. Just the narrow asphalt ribbon winding up through the black trees. The driver leaned out his window again, this time shouting something I couldn't make out over the wind and the rattle of his engine. His voice sounded strangled, furious, scared. I lowered my window an inch, then 2, listening. And that's when something heavy landed on the roof of my car. Not a branch. Not debris. Something with weight. Enough weight to make the metal above me thump inward slightly. The kind of sound that makes your pulse freeze because it's not supposed to happen, not on an empty mountain road in the dead of night. I instinctively ducked, heart hammering, gripping the wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. The tapping turned into scraping, like nails dragging slowly across the roof. I slammed on the brakes. The car fishtailed slightly before catching itself and skidding onto the gravel shoulder. The instant the car stopped, whatever was on the roof shifted, sliding across the metal with a wet, dragging sound before dropping off the back. I didn't look immediately. Couldn't. My breath was stuck in my throat and the cold air pouring through the cracked window felt thick enough to choke on. When I finally forced myself to check the rearview mirror, all I saw was movement, a pale shape scrambling across the pavement behind me, impossibly fast, low to the ground, like a person moving on hands and feet but not in any way I recognized. It bolted into the brush on the side of the road without a sound except for the rustle of leaves and the whisper of something sliding over gravel. The coal truck had pulled far ahead by then, its taillights flashing erratically as if the driver was still trying to signal me. I saw it stop near the top of the ridge, his brake lights glowing red through the early morning fog. He climbed out of the cab slowly, leaning heavily on the door like he was exhausted beyond belief. He didn't approach me. Instead, he raised his arm again, but this time it wasn't frantic or panicked. It was a slow, resigned salute, a gesture that felt like a warning, or maybe an apology. Then he got back into the truck and drove off into the dark, disappearing beyond the bend. For several minutes, I just sat there with my hands locked on the wheel, every muscle tight, listening to the empty mountain air. Nothing moved. Nothing tapped. Nothing breathed near me. Eventually, I rolled the window up and forced myself to get the car moving again. I stayed far under the speed limit, afraid that going too fast might stir up whatever had been on the roof. When I finally reached the next county line, the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges, and for the first time since the tapping began, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit 24-hour diner off the main highway. I parked under a street lamp and walked around the car, hesitant with each step. The roof looked normal at first glance, but when I leaned closer, I saw long streaks of dirt and moisture trailing from front to back. Smudged lines that looked like handprints, though the spacing was all wrong, too wide, too uneven. There were scratches too. Thin, chaotic marks etched into the paint. Some shallow. Some deep enough to reveal bare metal beneath. I drove the rest of the way home in broad daylight, trying to rationalize everything. Convincing myself it could have been an animal, or debris, or even my own tired mind. But reason only goes so far when you've heard something crawl across the metal above your head. For days afterward, I kept checking the roof, the windows, the undercarriage. I parked farther from trees. Slept with the porch light on. Told myself I was being ridiculous. But there's something about that night I can't shake. Something about the driver's face in that mirror, twisted in fear not for himself, but for me. Something about the way he tried so hard to warn me, knowing whatever was out there wasn't after him. It was after the nearest thing it could find. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone late at night and the road narrows and the trees press in too close, I swear I can hear it again. The faintest tapping beneath the car, the soft scrape of something testing the thin layer of metal between us, as if it remembers me, recognizes the sound of my engine, and is waiting for the right moment to climb back on. I'd driven that switchback road near Blackwater Ridge countless times over the years, always in the dark, always with a knot in my stomach that I could never quite shake, the kind of road that winds tight around steep ridges, dropping off sharply into hollows where the trees seem to reach across the pavement like they're trying to grab at anything foolish enough to pass by. And most nights I tell myself it's just the isolation, that my mind is playing tricks with shadows and the way the fog rolls off the hollows. But that night, that one particular night, everything about the place felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I had taken that road to shave time, cutting through late after a long day, the sky low and heavy with clouds, a distant promise of rain in the air that made every leaf and branch glisten in the weak light of my headlights. The moment I crested a particularly sharp curve, I saw it, a single steady glow off the tree line, pale yellow, soft yet insistent. My first thought was a camper, maybe a hunter, or someone foolish enough to leave a lantern lit. But as I drove closer, the light didn't flicker with fire or sway with wind. It stayed perfectly still, a solitary eye in the dark forest. I slowed without realizing it, the road beneath me curling into the next switchback, trying to get a better look without taking my eyes off the strange, out-of-place illumination. My curiosity, though I tried to fight it, got the better of me. I found a small pull-off and parked, letting the car idle as I considered turning back. I didn't. Something about that light felt expectant, like it had been waiting for someone, and for reasons I couldn't understand, it felt like it was waiting for me. I stepped out, the night immediately pressing in on me, the air thick with the scent of damp pine and wet earth, and I followed a narrow footpath that led from the roadside toward the glow. The light grew brighter as I walked, though not with intensity, more with clarity, like it was guiding me deliberately, as if someone or something had placed it there to be found. I expected to hear creaking branches, the cry of a nocturnal animal, or the whistle of wind through the trees, but there was nothing. Not a sound beyond the soft scrape of my boots over moss and leaf litter. When I finally reached the cabin, it was exactly as the light had promised. An unassuming structure, small but solid, perched in a clearing I had never seen before despite traveling that road for years. It looked lived in yet untouched, as if someone had swept the floor and gone away moments earlier, leaving only the light burning. Hesitation held me at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, my chest tight, heart hammering, unsure whether to knock, call out, or simply run back down the path, but the glow drew me in, gentle and commanding. I stepped up to the door and found it unlocked, swinging inward with a creak that sounded louder than it should in the profound silence, and as soon as I crossed the threshold, I realized something odd. The cabin smelled warm and earthy, a mixture of wood smoke that wasn't quite burning and fresh coffee, yet the air was still, without movement, without life, without a hint of whoever had been making that aroma. The interior was immaculate. Fresh wood shavings covered part of the floor, chips from recent carpentry or repair, still sharp and fragrant. A small pot of coffee sat on the stove, steam curling lazily, the liquid dark and rich. The rocking chair by the hearth swayed slowly, not haphazardly, but with a deliberate, steady motion, as if someone had just left it. I froze, my stomach knotting, noticing that despite the warmth and signs of habitation, there was no sound. No ticking clock, no hum of generator, no distant creak of timber settling. The place was alive in some ways, yet utterly dead in others, a contradiction that pressed down on me. I moved further inside, drawn toward the far wall where dozens of maps were pinned haphazardly yet purposefully. Each map marked the same road I had just driven, though across different years and in various pens, some neat, some frantic, some fading. Handwritten notes, carefully scrawled in all of them, repeated the same warning over and over: stay on the pavement. Do not stop. My fingers itched to touch the paper to understand why someone would go through such effort, yet some part of me, primal and instinctive, held me back. I felt suddenly very small in the immense quiet of the room. I turned slowly, and that's when the creak happened behind me. The rocking chair had stopped. Completely. The faint sway of wood against wood vanished, leaving nothing but my own shallow breathing and the faint hum of the unseen night outside. My pulse spiked, and I realized with a cold certainty that I wasn't alone, though I couldn't see anyone, hear anyone, smell anyone. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest, making each inhalation a labor. My mind screamed at me to leave, to bolt, to never come back, but my legs moved sluggishly, as if weighed down by invisible anchors. I backed toward the door slowly, avoiding turning my head, because I knew instinctively that looking over my shoulder would give form to whatever had been watching me, and yet I could feel eyes tracking me from somewhere in the darkness of the cabin, hidden just beyond the corner of vision. Each step toward the threshold felt like trudging through water. When my hand finally found the doorframe, the warmth of the outside air hit me like a wave, the path back to the car seeming impossibly long despite only being a few dozen feet. I broke into a quickened pace, almost running, leaving the cabin behind but not the weight of the dread it had imprinted on me. The light from inside flicked off all at once as I crossed the clearing, plunging the forest into shadow and leaving only the soft glow of the night sky above. I didn't look back. I didn't slow until I was back in the car, doors locked, engine running, and even then the sense of being observed lingered, a heavy, oppressive presence pressing at my shoulders, my neck, my very soul. The drive down the ridge was torturous. Every tree, every branch, every curve in the road seemed to mock me, as if they remembered where I had been and what I had seen. My headlights illuminated familiar terrain, yet each shadow felt strange, alive, purposeful. I gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white and my eyes refused to blink, afraid that if I did, I might miss the glimmer of that cabin light appearing again in some unexpected hollow, or worse, the subtle movement of someone, or something, waiting in the periphery, tracking my progress. I reached the base of the ridge and the first signs of inhabited roads, faint street lamps and distant traffic, without incident, but the tension did not leave me. It followed me home, sitting silently in the corners of my vision, making shadows twitch where there should be none. In the following days I drove past that stretch again, but the clearing was gone. No footpath, no cabin, no light. Just forest closing in tighter than memory, as if it had never been there at all. Yet I knew it had existed. The smell of wood shavings, the warmth of the coffee, the gentle sway of that empty rocking chair. They remained imprinted in my senses, haunting me. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is low and the forest is silent, I swear I can feel that same quiet pressure in the air, like the cabin is out there somewhere, waiting, observing, sending its warning through the night. Stay on the pavement. Do not stop. And even now, when I drive the ridge at twilight, I find myself gripping the wheel a little tighter at every curve, listening for the faintest creak, the light of a cabin appearing in the tree line, the rocking chair moving on its own, and I realize that some warnings are not meant to be understood, only obeyed, and that in the hollows of Blackwater Ridge, some things linger quietly, watching, shaping the dark, and the moment you look away, or think you're safe, you might discover that even a light in the distance can be more dangerous than the deepest shadow. I had been driving that stretch of highway for hours, the kind of road that snakes through the hollows and ridges so tightly that you barely see the turn coming until you're right on top of it. And that night, fog had rolled in thick and heavy, the kind that eats headlights and swallows the world until it feels like you're moving through a tunnel carved of gray mist. And I remember gripping the wheel tightly, ears straining for any sound besides the engine and the occasional scrape of tires on asphalt, knowing full well that if a deer or a stray branch appeared suddenly, there wouldn't be enough reaction time to avoid it. The road ahead twisted and climbed, cutting through dense woods where the fog hung like a curtain between the trees, and I had been doing my best to keep speed low, heart hammering, every shadow flickering in the headlights making me flinch. Then, around a particularly blind bend, I saw him, a figure standing on the shoulder, perfectly still, tall, wearing a coat that looked far too thin for the night air that had a chill to it, damp enough to sink into your clothes, the kind of cold that gets into your bones. At first I thought it was just another traveler, a stranded hiker or someone foolish enough to walk the highway at this hour. But something about the way he stood, the stillness of him, made me slow. Then I noticed the impossible detail that froze me completely. The headlights behind me cast my car's long shadow on the wet pavement, but there was no shadow of him. None. Not even a faint, ghostly outline. My fingers tightened on the wheel, knuckles white, and I slowed even further, the tires whispering across the slick asphalt. The figure lifted his hands slowly, palm facing me. Not a wave, not a greeting, but a warning, deliberate and unnerving in its calm. I didn't want to stop, yet my instincts screamed that stopping might be worse than driving past. I rolled the window down an inch, just enough to hear him without letting the cold or fog in fully, and his voice came, soft and muffled, like it had to travel through glass or a wall, almost unreal in its clarity yet impossibly present. You shouldn't stop. I swallowed hard, unsure if he was talking to me, to the car, or to something invisible that followed the road, and my heartbeat started hammering in my ears as the fog thickened around us, narrowing the world to the space just ahead and the presence of that impossible man. I hesitated, creeping forward, eyes darting to him, then to the gray road swallowed in fog, and without warning his hand dropped, pointing straight ahead as if to direct me, and I followed the gesture with my headlights. That's when the fog shifted just enough to reveal it. Another car, half blocking the lane, lights out, the driver invisible, the front end smashed in a grotesque angle, as if it had collided with something so sudden, so solid, that it left no chance for escape. My body tensed, adrenaline flooding my veins, and I swerved instinctively, heart hammering, the tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement, narrowly avoiding a direct hit, the smell of burnt rubber and wet asphalt filling my nose as I regained control. My eyes darted back toward the shoulder where the hitchhiker had been, but he was gone. Completely gone. No footprints in the wet asphalt, no movement in the fog, no lingering figure. Nothing. It was as if he had never been there, and yet I knew with a certainty that defied logic that I had not imagined him. I pressed on, hands white-knuckled on the wheel, scanning the road ahead, every shadow and flicker of fog twisting into possibilities. None of them good. The mind wants to rationalize. Maybe it was a trick of the headlights, a tree branch caught in motion, a figment of exhaustion. But rationality felt hollow, impossible in the weight of what had just occurred, and the image of him, tall and impossibly still, hand raised, palm outward, warning me, haunted me in ways I could not name. Each curve of the road, each dip in the asphalt seemed to echo his warning, and I kept imagining him standing just beyond the mist, pointing me away from danger I couldn't yet see. I drove for miles in tense silence, every nerve ending straining, eyes darting to the roadside, watching the fog, half expecting him to reappear, to guide me or admonish. me further. Eventually the road straightened, the fog thinned, and the familiar signs of the county emerged. Mile markers, the faint glow of distant streetlights, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I passed by houses with lights on, travelers heading the opposite direction, trucks humming along their own errands, and yet every now and then, in the corner of my vision, I thought I could see a tall figure, coat too thin for the night, standing at the edge of the fog, silent, watching, warning. I didn't stop for hours, not until I reached a well-lit town, lights of diners and gas stations glowing warmly, people moving in ways I had long forgotten, and even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting that impossibly still shadowless man to emerge from the gray, pointing, lifting a hand, guiding me to some unseen danger I could only barely sense. I've never returned to that stretch of road at night, not alone, and not even in the daylight without a companion, and the memory has never faded. Sometimes I lie awake, fog rolling in outside, streetlights struggling to pierce the mist, and I see his hand raised, palm out, warning, and I can almost feel the weight of it pressing through the years, pressing through the world, insisting I never stop, never linger, never forget. I think of the car I swerved around, the smashed front end sitting in the fog like a corpse abandoned in the gray, and I wonder in those quiet moments, when the road is empty and the night feels too still, what would have happened if I had ignored him, if I had stopped, if I had rolled the window down fully or stepped onto the shoulder? What cost might have been exacted in the gray, where shadows are weightless and warnings are delivered silently by figures who do not belong in the world of men? I don't believe in omens or signs, not usually, but that night changed me. It forced a kind of awareness that lives in my chest like a permanent echo, a pulse that quickens whenever I approach foggy bends, the kind where the world vanishes beyond your headlights, where the road itself becomes uncertain, and in the corner of my eye, I sometimes swear I still see him, tall, coat too thin, hand raised in that slow, deliberate warning, telling me to go, telling me to run, telling me that some things out there are older and more patient than any human, waiting for the moment we might make the mistake of stopping, and I will never, ever forget the look in his shadowless eyes, the impossible stillness of a man who should not have been, and the absolute certainty that his warning saved me from a fate I do not even want to imagine. And even now, decades later, when I drive past that bend, in the same fog or similar, I still feel my pulse quicken, my hands tighten on the wheel, my eyes scan the roadside, half expecting to see that impossibly still figure, half expecting the road itself to remember, to hold the memory of that night, and I know that I will never see that road the same way again, and that some warnings, silent and shadowless, are not meant to be questioned, only obeyed, because the price of stopping is something the mind cannot hold, and the soul cannot fully comprehend, and every time I remember the hand, palm facing outward, I remember the narrow scrape of the tires, the smell of wet asphalt and fear, the impossibility of what I saw, and the certainty that some things out there watch the roads, watch the living, and only act when necessary, and sometimes, just sometimes, the world parts long enough for you to glimpse their patience, their knowledge, their warning, and you are lucky if you heed it. I had been driving north past the Tennessee line late that night, the kind of road that curves endlessly between ridges and hollows, where the trees crowd in and block out every hint of civilization, and the fog lay low in the valleys, thick and damp, carrying the smell of wet pine and cold earth, and I remember gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, knowing that one wrong move on the slick asphalt could send me sliding into a ditch or over the edge, and the radio, which had been my only company for hours, cut out suddenly, static hissing like a snake in the speakers, and I fumbled with the dial, trying to scan stations, expecting only silence or the low hum of distant stations fading in and out, but instead it froze on a signal I'd never encountered before, thin and distant, almost fragile, a melody that sounded like an old front porch fiddle played by someone leaning into the wind, the notes wavering and trembling as though the instrument were being held by hands that had been weathered and worn by years I couldn't count, and then, beneath the music, a man's voice came through, low and deliberate, announcing the station as if it had always existed in the folds of the mountains. WSNT broadcasting from the Lost Ridge, and my stomach turned cold because I had never heard of it. No maps, no online records, nothing, and later when I searched I found only empty results, like the station had been conjured from the dark itself, as though it were meant to exist, only for travelers like me, wandering the roads when the night is deepest. The fiddle faded into soft static, and a rustling filled the speakers, like someone adjusting the microphone, small, deliberate movements that made the hairs on my arms stand up, and then the voice came again, calm and almost sorrowful, saying, Car headed northbound. You're not alone out there, and I froze because I was headed north, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles went white, breath catching in my throat, eyes scanning the roadside and the edges of the trees where the fog made the shapes of trunks into looming shadows, tall and silent, pressing in, and I realized I had no idea who or what was out there, and the next words from the radio, quiet but steady, made my blood run ice cold. Don't look to your left. I swear I didn't want to, but of course I did, because some instinct somewhere, that foolish human curiosity, forced my gaze toward the tree line, and there it was. A tall silhouette, completely still, the outline of a person but wrong somehow, disproportionate, leaning slightly as though it had grown from the shadows themselves, facing me, unblinking, close enough that I could feel its attention like heat pressing against my skin, yet far enough that I couldn't make out features, couldn't tell if it moved at all, and my chest tightened as I gripped the wheel, every nerve taut, waiting for it to vanish, for this to be some trick of the fog or a tree catching my peripheral vision, but it didn't move. It didn't blink. It simply stood, waiting, patient, like it had been there all along, like it had been listening to every mile I had driven, every exhale, every heartbeat. I wanted to look away, to focus on the road, to ignore the impossible radio, but my eyes kept darting back to the dark outline, and when I did, the voice came again, soft now, almost mournful, instructing me to keep going, and the static rose and fell like a living thing, a soft, sibilant whisper that filled the car, surrounding me, pressing against the windows, crawling along the roof and dashboard, a tactile presence of sound that made my teeth ache and my stomach churn. I pulled to the side of the road, hands shaking uncontrollably, gripping the wheel as though holding it might keep me tethered to reality, and the radio hissed, more rustling, more movement in the microphone, and I could almost hear breathing, soft and measured, patient, deliberate, and the man spoke again, closer now, more intimate, his tone carrying something I couldn't name but recognized immediately. Sorrow, patience, warning. Do not look to your left, he said again, and I tried to obey, but the car's headlights and the natural inclination of human fear forced my eyes sideways, and the silhouette was gone, nothing but fog and trees where it had been, yet I felt the presence still, like a memory of heat pressing against my skin, a residue of attention that did not vanish when the figure itself did. The radio was dead, the fiddle vanished, and the night became oppressively quiet, the absence of sound somehow worse than the static and music, the silence stretching into the valleys and hills, pressing in, heavy, unnatural. I started the car again, hands trembling, scanning the road with every passing second, willing the next mile to reveal normality, some sign that the world had returned to its proper shape, but every curve, every ridge, every dark hollow seemed to thrum with expectation, as if the trees themselves had noticed me and bent closer to watch, and even with the car moving, I could feel the weight of that silhouette, the insistence of the voice, a warning I couldn't shake. I remembered later, when recounting the story to myself and to others who didn't know the road, that the signal had vanished at the same instant I had looked back, like the radio itself was tied to perception, only functioning when I allowed the figure to exist in the fog, and I wondered if the broadcast was ever real, or if it had been an extension of the figure's will, a warning delivered only through some strange, impossible medium, something that exists only in the dark, waiting for the right traveler, the right car, the right moment to intervene. The remainder of the drive was torturous. Every mile stretched unnaturally, the fog seeming thicker with each curve, the trees closing in as if to remind me that nothing in that hollow was ordinary, and every shadow at the edge of my vision threatened to regain form, to become the figure once more, patient, waiting, knowing that any lapse in attention might be fatal. I drove with the radio off, even though the silence was worse than the signal, the emptiness of the night pressing against me with the weight of eyes I could not see. When I finally reached more traveled roads, lights in the distance, signs of normalcy, I felt relief, but it was tempered by a gnawing unease, an understanding that the encounter had not left me fully, that some things remain even after they vanish from sight, imprinting themselves on perception, on thought, on memory, and that the road, the fog, and the impossible broadcast were still out there, somewhere, waiting for another northbound car, another traveler alone in the dark, and I realized. That part of me will always remember that night, will always feel the chill, the presence, the impossible warning, the insistence of eyes in the fog, and even now, years later, whenever I pass a stretch of dark highway, especially those valleys where fog gathers like a living thing, I feel my pulse quicken, I glance to the sides of the road, my hands tighten on the wheel, and I wonder if that radio might return, if that tall figure will appear again, silent, patient, waiting, and I know with a Certainty that chills me to the bone that some things in the hollows of Appalachia are patient beyond reason, that warnings can travel through impossible mediums, and that the night itself can be alive in ways we do not understand, watching, waiting, teaching the same lesson over and over. Do not look, do not stop, and even then, the lesson does not guarantee safety, only survival, and even now, when I close my eyes, I see the faint outline, feel the heat of attention, hear the faintest scratch of static in the corner of my mind, and I know I was not meant to forget. I had been driving late along Route 33, the kind of winding road that threads through hollows and ridges so tightly that you can't see the next curve until you're on it. The night thick with fog that rolled in low over the valleys and clung to the trees like a living thing, damp and cold enough to sink into your clothes, and I remember the hum of my tires on the asphalt, steady and unremarkable, until I caught it in the corner of my rear view. A car I barely noticed at first, an old sedan, blue. Paint faded, one hubcap missing, windshield cracked, but it was nothing that should have stood out in that patch of highway, a vehicle lost among the shadows and the fog, and yet as I drove on, it became impossible to ignore, because no matter what I did, it matched my every movement. I thought maybe I had imagined it, maybe some trick of the headlights or the fog, but when I changed lanes, it followed. When I slowed, it slowed. When I accelerated, it accelerated. It stayed the same distance behind me, perfectly steady, not wavering, not swerving, not turning off when exits appeared. For the next 30 miles, the car haunted me, silent in its pursuit, tires humming against the asphalt in a rhythm that matched mine, engine low and unchanging, and I began testing it, curiosity and fear mixing into something tight in my chest, first by slowing deliberately, then speeding, taking a random exit that led into a tiny gravel lot beside a small, closed diner, half expecting the car to lose interest or veer away. But it followed, obedient, silent, patient, maintaining the same exact distance. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe some prankster, a cop doing a weird patrol, a lost tourist, but nothing fit. I pulled into the lot of a nearby church, hoping the lights or the few cars parked there would deter whoever was inside. And the sedan rolled in behind me, stopping precisely behind my vehicle. That's when my chest went cold. I stepped out slowly, trying to sound calm, muscles tight and alert, expecting someone to emerge, someone to explain this bizarre behavior, someone who could rationalize what was happening. But when I reached the hood of my car and glanced at the sedan, the driver's seat was empty. All the seats were empty. The engine hummed as if someone, impossibly, had a foot on the pedal without being present, and the whole thing, the vehicle, the quiet, the impossible obedience, pressed against my mind like weight I couldn't shake. I backed away, heart pounding, and then the horn honked, one long steady blare that wasn't aggressive, not in warning or menace, but oddly, calling, like it had been waiting for me to acknowledge it, like it had been trying to communicate in the only way a machine could, and the sound reverberated through the empty lot, bouncing off the brick of the church and the darkened hills behind it. I retreated to my car, locking the doors quickly, hands trembling, unsure if I wanted to look again or just drive, and as soon as I pulled onto the highway, the sedan merged behind me once more, settling into that same impossible distance, not veering, not reacting to other vehicles, not even blinking a headlight. My eyes flicked to the rear view constantly, and every mile stretched endlessly, every curve and hill of Route 33 becoming a landscape of dread, the fog wrapping around the trees and the road like a living shroud, and the thought that some unseen presence was controlling that car, guiding it, waiting for me, began to gnaw at my mind. I passed the small bridges, the overgrown hollows, the abandoned homes, each one ordinary and yet transformed by the presence of that empty car, as if it had made the whole world uncertain, and every shadow at the roadside threatened to regain form, to take shape in ways that my rational mind could not tolerate. I tried shaking it off, forcing myself to think that maybe it had pulled off, that maybe my nerves were exaggerating, that maybe the fog was playing tricks, but every glance confirmed the impossible. The car was there, silent, steady, patient, following me with the consistency of some cold, deliberate will. I considered pulling over to confront it again, but the memory of the horn, the emptiness of the seats, and the low hum of the engine made my hands sweat, and I realized confrontation was meaningless, that some things do not require explanation, that some presences exist in the world simply to remind you of your fragility, your vulnerability, and your inability to truly control the road you think you know. Mile after mile, I drove with that car behind me, Route 33 stretching endlessly, the fog thickening in patches, the black shapes of trees looming closer than usual, branches brushing the edges of my headlights, each hollowed-out ditch and dip in the road seeming to whisper that the sedan was patient, that it would follow me as long as necessary, and I began counting exits, turns, mile markers, desperately calculating some way to escape, only to realize the road itself seemed to funnel me in one direction, narrowing the possibilities until the only thing I could do was drive straight, heart hammering, mind taut with fear and anticipation. Hours seemed to pass in minutes, each mile a test of endurance, and finally, near the county line, where Route 33 cuts past old mining land abandoned for decades, the sedan made a final, deliberate turn down a side road that led nowhere, into the ruins of forgotten shafts and collapsed buildings, and I understood in that moment that whatever had been following me had no interest in confrontation, no interest in pursuit beyond the limit of its domain, and that sense of measured, controlled detachment, the calm patience of the empty car, stayed with me long after I passed the county line. Miles away, engine thrumming beneath me, hands white on the wheel, chest tight, unable to shake the sense of attention, of observation, of purpose. I haven't driven Route 33 at night since. I avoid that stretch of highway entirely, taking longer, safer roads, and even now, years later, whenever I see a car at night following too closely, too patiently, I feel a flash of that same dread, that same knowing certainty that I was watched, that I was chosen for a particular, inexplicable test, and that whatever followed me that night existed in a way I cannot explain, cannot quantify, and will not encounter again, except in memory, where the road curves endlessly through fog and shadows, and the blue sedan waits in silence, patient, empty, eternal. I had always driven past Cold Creek Bridge during the day, a narrow, nondescript span over a sluggish creek, its boards weathered and worn, steel rails rusted in places, and the locals' warnings about crossing it after midnight always sounded like the usual Appalachian superstition. Old wives' tales spun to keep kids from wandering or to make the road seem more dangerous than it really was. But that night, I found myself stranded at its edge, the car coughing and groaning before dying entirely, the headlights dimming to an anemic glow, and I realized immediately that superstition had nothing to do with what was happening. The fog hung heavy in the hollows, curling around the ridges and pooling beneath the bridge like spilled milk, and the creek itself, usually a gentle trickle, seemed to stretch into black water that swallowed sound, leaving only a damp, oppressive quiet. I stepped out of the car, the boards of the bridge creaking faintly under my weight, each footfall an audible punctuation in the otherwise still night, and I heard it then, the first set of steps, heavy and deliberate, coming toward me from the other end, echoing on the boards with a rhythm that made my stomach knot. I scanned the length of the bridge. Nothing. No cars, no pedestrians, no animals, not even a breeze to set the wooden board shivering. Yet the steps continued, slow, methodical, drawing closer with each heartbeat, pressing against me with an almost tangible weight, and I felt my skin prickle, every hair on my arm standing at attention. My phone's flashlight flickered, stuttering in the darkness, even though the battery had been nearly full moments ago, and the weak beam barely cut through the mist that hugged the rails. I froze, every sense straining, and then I became aware of a presence, close, just off to my side, something observing me, patient, deliberate, silent but heavy with intent, the air around me seeming to thicken, pressing against my chest with a kind of suffocating stillness that makes your lungs ache, and then a voice came, low, calm, strained with effort, directly beside my ear, so close I could feel the heat of it as if the speaker had leaned into my skin. You shouldn't linger. Not on my bridge. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, eyes wide, scanning the empty boards for the source, and the footsteps continued past me, fading into the distance at the far end of the span, each one leaving an echo that bounced off the rails in the fog, lingering just long enough to make the silence after them seem unbearable. My hands shook as I fumbled with the ignition, willing the car to start, praying the engine would roar to life so I could escape, and miraculously, it did, turning over on the first attempt, headlights flaring weakly into the mist. I didn't look in the mirrors, didn't glance sideways at the rails, just drove forward, the bridge groaning and creaking beneath me like it was alive, each board shivering under the weight of the car, and I could feel the history of that span pressing in. The countless nights, the warnings whispered by locals, the things that had been seen and not seen, the heavy presence that waited in the shadows, patient, inevitable. Once I cleared the far end, the fog thinned slightly, and the world beyond seemed normal again. The creek rushing quietly, trees swaying gently, distant lights glimmering on ridges, and yet the weight of what I had encountered stayed with me. A cold presence settled into my chest, a pulse that quickened whenever I thought of that bridge, whenever I imagined the slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in the blackness, carrying someone or something, whose patience spanned decades, whose ownership of that span of wood and steel was absolute and unchallengeable. I drove the rest of the night without stopping, every mile rattling through my mind, replaying the voice, the proximity, the sheer impossibility of what I had felt, and I realized with a clarity that made my stomach twist that the bridge wasn't just a place to cross, but a sentinel, a keeper, a guardian of boundaries I had no right to challenge, and anyone who lingers risks drawing attention they cannot comprehend. Days later, I spoke cautiously with a local, an old man with deep lines and a voice that carried the timbre of decades spent in hollows, and he nodded knowingly when I mentioned the bridge, eyes flicking to the east where it disappeared into the trees. He didn't need to explain, didn't need to tell me why no one should cross it after midnight. The warning, when spoken by him, carried the same gravity that I had experienced, that presence that I had felt leaning just out of reach, whispering caution, observing, waiting. I never returned to that stretch of road at night, and I have avoided it entirely in the years since, choosing longer routes through ridges and hollows I know better. The thought of that bridge and the echoing footsteps pressing against me whenever the road curves and darkness thickens. Sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is still, I swear I hear the faint echo of wood creaking in rhythm, measured, deliberate, a memory of those heavy, patient steps, and I feel the cold press against my skin again. Hear the calm, strained voice warning me not to linger, and I know that Cold Creek Bridge is not just a structure, not just a crossing, but a presence in its own right, one that demands respect, one that records the missteps of those who dare, one that watches patiently. From the shadows after midnight, and even in daylight, when the boards seem ordinary and the creek runs clear, I feel the weight of it in the hollows of my mind, the reminder that some roads, some bridges, and some nights carry more than the simple passage of travelers. They carry guardians, witnesses, and warnings that transcend understanding, and I will never, ever forget the night I broke down at the edge of that bridge, felt the footsteps approaching, and heard the voice so close beside me. Warning, patient, inevitable, as if the bridge itself had marked me, set me apart, and let me leave only because I obeyed its will, not because I was safe.